Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Faisal Abbas. I'm the editor-in-chief of Arab News from Saudi Arabia. Managed to make it here despite the general strike. In fact, all of us here came from all over the world, so quite an achievement. This session is going to be in English, but I believe you have the translation devices on your seats. Given how beautiful this place is, I promise you that I'm working on my Greek, so hopefully when I'm back here next year, we will do this panel in Greek. And our panel today is about a subject that is close to all our hearts. It's actually the heart of our profession. Our panel today is called Information, Influence, and Integrity, the media's role in a modern democracy. And allow me first to start by introducing the excellent panel that we have with us this afternoon. Right to my right is Suzanne Lynch, who is the global Playbook author and associate editor at Politico. And right next to Suzanne is Andrew Mueller, who's a journalist, author, and contributor at Monocle. And last but certainly not least, my very good friend, Gerard Baker, who is the editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal in the United States. Gerard, where you are seems to be making a lot of headlines in many aspects, tariffs, politics, but also the relationship with the media. And now it has been less than 3 months since the new administration took office. We've already seen almost unprecedented actions towards the media. The Associated Press has been barred to attend White House briefings for refusing to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. The rest of the world, perhaps, where I certainly come from a part of the world where there isn't something called a First Amendment, are a bit confused as to what's going on. What's the vibe in the United States when it comes to the relationship with the media?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Faisal, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be in this beautiful and historic place. Of course, you know, birthplace of democracy, as we in the West like to think of it. And of course, much of the United States certainly derives many of its democratic traditions from classical civilization. This one, you know, the freedom of the press, which is obviously something that's been very important in any democracy over the hundreds of years. And of course, as you said, the First Amendment is enshrined in the US Constitution. Unlike many other countries around the world, there is a formal constitutional protection of free speech. And I think it's fair to say it remains very lively and very active. I haven't seen any particular evidence of news organizations particularly kind of holding back in their reporting or their criticism of Donald Trump. I think anybody who's been conscious for the last 11 weeks will have been reading everything about Donald Trump has done. And I think it's fair to say that if you read the New York Times or you look at the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or CNN or the New York Times, or CNN or MSNBC or almost any other news organization, any of the major news organizations in America, Politico, maybe Breitbart, maybe slightly different, but you've seen a robust reporting of everything that Donald Trump has been doing from a very critical perspective. So I'm a little skeptical so far that the kind of this idea that many people said with Donald Trump that, that was going to be a repressive authoritarian regime where journalists would be plucked from their beds in the middle of the night for writing critical pieces or reporting critically on it. We haven't seen any of that yet. I mean, admittedly, it's early days, but I haven't seen it. The AP case you refer to, Faisal, this is, strictly speaking, AP were not banned from briefings. They were actually, the White House, I don't want to get too technical, but the White House there is a small pool of reporters who are chosen to follow the president at very close quarters wherever he goes inside the White House when he's traveling internally or domestically or whatever. That pool typically was selected by members of the press themselves. This White House said, no, we would pick that pool ourselves. And then they decided that because the Associated Press refused to, in its reporting, to describe the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America as the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, they were banned from that immediate pool. As it happens, a judge today, a federal judge, I think, sorry, last night or today, actually overruled that and said the White House actually had to reinstate them. So look, I mean, I think, and I know we're going to talk more broadly about the media climate in the world, but I know there are concerns, and there are, some, and by the way, Donald Trump says things about the media, like being the enemy of the people, and his people do things like, not liking particular members of the media, and maybe excluding them from certain briefings that do look hostile and certainly inconsistent with the principles of the First Amendment or free speech. But that's not very new. Other presidents have done that. Barack Obama, didn't like Fox News, and so he, largely excluded them from a lot of what he was doing. So while I think we need to be eternally vigilant in the old saying about protecting press freedom, I don't think anything I've seen so far in the first 11 weeks of the Trump administration suggests to me that the United States is turning into Vladimir Putin's Russia.
No, and I want to thank you for adding that. Actually, you're right. A judge did overrule the case for, and the AP is back. We have seen, though, the Secretary of State come out and say that they will stop issuing or even revoke visas for people, tourists or migrants who criticize the United States. Would it be a stretch to think that that might extend to journalists being issued I-visas?
Well, again, we need to be very careful about the specific sort of taxonomy, the terminology that the administration has been using. The cases that have come up so far, the administration has said apply to people who they believe, and again, they may be wrong, and again, many of these cases are being challenged in court, and the US obviously does have an independent judiciary, have said there are people who are not just expressing opinions they don't like, but they're they're taking part in activities that are in contravention of the terms of their visa. Under the terms of their visa, if you're a student, for example, you're not supposed to, take place in what turn into violent protests on, university campuses and things like that. So it's not, again, it's a question of what specific rules people are adhering to when they are permitted into the United States. There is not, however, an attempt to stop people from expressing views, writing writing or broadcasting or getting up and speaking out about the administration. So I think a lot of that kind of alarmism is somewhat overdone right now.
Clear. Suzanne, how does it look from your end? I mean, you're based in Belgium, correct?
Yeah.
How does it look from Europe?
I mean, I would reiterate a lot of what Gerard is saying there. I'm in Brussels, the EU. It's quite comparable to Washington because you've got these hundreds of journalists who are in Brussels covering the EU and covering NATO. I did cover the first Trump administration for 4 years for the Irish Times. And ironically, just to reiterate what Gerard said, the American system, it has got an incredibly free press because of this constitutional protection. So it's easier really to get into a briefing in the White House than it is to get into the European Commission. And that is true. That was during the first Trump administration. So I would say that. However, I think what the concern now here is this subtle impact this is going to have on maybe younger journalists and on the coverage. We're hearing the drama of AP being thrown out of the court case. But I mean, this is the classic model, how democracies die. It happens slowly, it happens very subtly. And number one, I would be worried about, in a couple of years, does this impinge, particularly on younger journalists, are they going to be as unaware of this? Are they going to just be completely objective? So that would be one issue, I would say. And second of all, and I think this is the key issue really, is that by banning AP, what's happening now is that I think Donald Trump and the current administration is sowing a distrust of the media. And that's what's, I think, worrying. I don't think I agree with you. I don't think people are really going to change at the moment the way they're going to write about it. But when the President of the United States starts questioning, completely erroneously, the motives and the profession of journalism, I think that's very worrying, and I think that may have an effect not just in America, but also around the world, where other more autocratic regimes may take this now as a model and may say, well, look, if they're doing that in America, the land of free speech, we can kind of clamp down on our own journalists.
But I want to ask you what your judgment is as a practicing journalist. Is the AP, I mean, we're not discussing whether they should be banned or not. That's a separate case, and I think that was overruled. But if you were the editor of the AP, would you have made that same decision to refuse to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America when the administration has signed an executive order renaming it on maps, and even Google has changed?
Well, I think from what, and I'm not 100% sure in the details of this, but as far as I'm aware with Politico, a lot of other organizations haven't changed either. So this is the singling out. This is making a lesson of somebody. I mean, it's the classic technique. You know, when you want to repress, you pick one person in the schoolyard and you focus on that. But I think they've been vindicated now. Now, I think a key question is, we know the judgment came through, but what's going to happen next? I mean, is the White House going to act on this? I cannot see at this moment that they're just going to go, yes, fine, you can come back into the pool. So this may kind of add fuel to the fire in a way. You know, Donald Trump loves a battle. I can imagine this might be drawn out a little bit more. Well,
as time will certainly tell. Andrew, I want your thoughts on this topic before we move on to the business model of media for the future. Are we moving towards a more oppressive, a more limiting structure in democracies when it comes to the freedom of access and freedom of press?
I hope not, obviously. I think there's a lot in what Suzanne said, that, and also what Gerard said, that the United States, because of its unique constitutional relationship with freedom of speech and because of its enormous diplomatic, cultural and economic power, does kind of set a standard. You know, this is the idea of the United States as the arsenal of democracy, the exemplar of democracy, etc. And so, yeah, there is a concern whereby much more repressive regimes around the world, which still is quite pretty much most of them, might think, well, if you can pull this stuff in the United States of all places, what can I get away with here? If that's now the standard in a place where free speech and a free press are supposed to be constitutionally protected, you know, I'm at liberty to be really unpleasant towards the press. But in the specific case of the AP, I think if you're in that position, I would, if I was the editor of the AP, I would take that as both an endorsement, like I'd include that in my advertising, you know, banned from the White House press pool by Donald Trump. An endorsement and a liberation, because it's not that there's no value in the idea of pool journalism or lobby journalism in the UK. It's not that there's no value at all in somebody in the position of president or prime minister having to be interrogated in public by the press. It is still, I think, broadly a good thing that though President Trump may do it because he kind of enjoys the Punch and Judy aspect, it's not nothing that the most powerful person on earth will still quite regularly just get yelled at by somebody with a notepad. That is a good thing, and we should never wish to lose that. But also, I don't think if you're a proper investigative outfit, especially as the AP is, I don't think you necessarily learn anything by being allowed into that room. So I think if you're the AP, one, you take that as an endorsement. Yeah, we've annoyed Donald Trump so much he's thrown us out of our press pool, or out of his press pool. That speaks to our integrity. And it also thinks, well, we don't have to worry about playing nice to get that access anymore. That's lost. So we're freed up to do actual journalism.
Can I just say, Faisal, if I may, and Suzanne touched on this point, it should also be noted that while, again, many of these concerns are legitimate, and I take what you say, Suzanne, about the effect on people thinking about going into journalism, younger people, the other aspects of the Trump White House, I've been in America for 30 years, I've covered every White House in that period, which is something like 7 different presidencies, 7 different terms of office. And Donald Trump is the most open and accessible to the media of any president that there's been by a mile. Donald Trump has held more press conferences, if you want to call them that, press availabilities, impromptu meetings with the press in his first 11 weeks in office than Joe Biden held in 4 years in office. You see him all the time. I mean, he can't stop talking. We all know what Donald Trump is like. He can't shut up. So, you know, whether he's on Air Force One and he wants to talk to people, or whether he's sitting in the Oval Office, or whether he's, you know, on his way to a meeting or up on Capitol Hill or whatever, he just gathers the press around him and speaks and answers questions. I'm not going to pretend he always tells the truth, because he doesn't. But the actual ability of journalists to ask him questions directly and, you know, on camera, in ways that could be awkward and often are very awkward for him and embarrassing for him, is much, much greater under Donald Trump than it was under Joe Biden, than it was under Barack Obama, I must say, too. So, you know, again, I don't dismiss these concerns that people have. But again, as Andrew just said, Trump does have this kind of love-hate relationship with the press that makes him constantly available to them.
No, I think that's a fair point. And of course, the inside joke in newsrooms is, why does he even need a spokesperson or press secretary? He's with journalists speaking all the time. But I want to, I mean, obviously, we started with this because of what you all alluded to, which is that, you know, United States, because of its First Amendment, represents the kind of the ultimate, or the model of free speech. But this, you know, Suzanne, you mentioned something about distrust, and I don't think distrust in media, or as many people like to describe it, traditional media, started with Donald Trump. We've been hearing about it for at least 10 or 15 years, really since the rise of social media, since the rise of bloggers. There is this overarching argument that traditional media can't be trusted. We have the insights, we have the scoop, we have the reality. They're just they're part of a big corporations, and they bend the knee to their paymasters, etc. So I want to get to that argument. Almost every study I've seen, including the Edelman Trust Barometer, shows a steady decline in trust in journalists. Do you feel it personally? As in, do you feel? I certainly do now. You feel that a certain influencer, for example, if for a lack of a better expression, who has a certain number of followers, has better access to press briefings and exclusives. Suzanne, do you feel it's affecting you in a place like Brussels?
Well, I think it is a reality, what you've just described, yes, about this distrust. And I think, not to bring it back again, but what's interesting as well is what's happening in Washington with the press pool is not so much, you know, AP getting banned, but it's the fact that the White House is making a conscious effort to bring in new media and alternative media right to the centre of power. So the Breitbart, which now seems a very established brand at this stage, so a lot of influencers, new media people are now there in a press room where they never ever were before, and they're not really there to the same extent in Brussels, probably in London, as they are now in the United States. So Donald Trump is legitimizing these outlets, and you know, the jury's out. Can they rise to the challenge? Can they get beyond? Can they do some real reporting? Can they do some real analysis? Can they hold him to account? This is their moment now. They're right in there in the Oval Office, in the press briefings. So I think we're at a very interesting moment that way. Also, I mean, we know, obviously, social media has been the huge dynamic in media over the last 15 to 20 years. And, you know, there was a lot we could say about this. I mean, but one of the issues seems to be that it was, at the beginning, even if you look back at the Arab Spring, I mean, it was seen as a kind of, you know, this is going to be the public town hall, this democratic experiment where everybody could chip in, and it's going to be citizen journalism. What we're seeing on platforms like X now, of course, is that it's just people are dividing even more into their own echo chambers. So actually it's become self-selecting, and it's reinforcing biases and you know, fake news in a lot of ways. People may have seen earlier this week, it was an extraordinary story about this one tweet that went out saying that Kevin Hassett in the White House had said that Donald Trump is going to do a 90-day pause on tariffs. It was wrong, it didn't happen, but it literally moved markets in a dramatic fashion. And that was an erroneous one tweet by one person on Twitter. So that's got serious implications. I mean, it's got very serious implications when it's coming to the markets and the amount of money that was lost over that. So I think we're in a kind of a moment of truth for these kind of voices on social media? Will they be able to continue to have the presence, the relevance that they have now? But I think they're going to have to prove themselves a bit more.
Well, they do say that a rumor or a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still wearing its trousers.
But on that, I mean, from the British tradition that we all know, or the Irish tradition in my case, I mean, defamation laws are so strong that if I wrote in Politico in Europe, if I wrote in the Irish Times something like that person had written on Twitter, I'd be fired in one set. I mean, we would be sued. It would bring down the newspaper. So there are different standards, obviously, for people writing on Twitter and more established news organisations, which is a whole other kind of regulatory issue that we're all grappling with, too.
No, I agree. And regulation in most part of the world hasn't caught up. So we're basically expected to produce journalism at a certain quality with certain regulations and standards, and the same rules don't apply for the other side. Which is obviously not to the advantage. And of course, there is the other aspect which I wanted to discuss with all of you, which is the business model aspect. It is certainly much more cost effective to be an individual who has a Twitter account or an Instagram account. You know, you could pay $15 and buy a unique URL website and put whatever you want on it. And the more sensational it is, the more traffic you're going to get, the more Google will reward you with advertising. The same doesn't apply for us for all of your institutions, whereby you know you have a legal department, you have copy editors, you have proofreaders, you have fact checkers. Am I right to believe that that news organizations to survive really need to think out of the box now in terms of how it gets? I mean, Monocle, correct me if I'm wrong, has branched out into opening coffee shops, very good coffee shops. And
they're very good coffee shops. Monocle does a whole bunch of stuff, yes, and we also have Wing Creative, the design, branding and advertising agency associated with the Monocle Media brand. But I think, for me, I think the way forward for what you might think of as legacy media lies in something like that. You build a community, you build this thing that people want to be part of, and that is all about having an identity and having the confidence to be what it is that you are. And when I think about some of the proper old school magazines that have survived and prospered into the modern era, you know, you think of a British magazine, the satirical/investigative journal Private Eye, which does fantastically well. It's printed on extremely cheap paper and gives every impression of being a shoestring outfit. It's not. But it strikes me that I've been reading Private Eye for as long as I've lived in the United Kingdom, which is about 35 years. And I think going back for about the first year I read it, I didn't understand any of it. Because like, why is everything continued on page 94 when there isn't a page 94? Why is the phrase discussing Uganda funny? Why do they keep printing this one picture of Andrew Neil? But once you start to understand the jokes, you feel like you're part of a club, and therefore you don't want to miss the next issue. And I see it all the time when we come to events like this, when Monocle does its own events, when we go out into the world, we meet lots of people who read the magazine, who listen to our radio station, who like our coffee shops, and who like our shops which sell, you know, clothes, household stuff, other things. There's a new one just opened in Paris, which I do recommend people visit. But they feel like they're part of something and they don't want to leave it. So they subscribe and they buy every issue and they keep listening to the radio station. And I think that is actually the way forward for any media organization, but the ones that especially already have, you know, a name that people recognize, they need to have confidence in that and to carry on building on that. And I think, yeah, as someone once said, if you do build it, they will come. There is a hankering out there for actual proper quality journalism, and I think if you provide it, you will find an audience.
I mean, Faisal, can I talk?
I was going to ask you, and I'll love to hear what you have to say, but speaking of brands that people trust, I mean, certainly among the investor worlds, the Wall Street Journal is out there. I know the Journal in particular is doing well financially, and I was about to ask you, what's the formula?
Okay.
But so, feel free to interject.
I was going to say, I was going to pick up on the trust issue because I think it is absolutely directly linked to the business model, which I'll talk about a little bit too. I think on trust, look, trust in the media has collapsed. It's absolutely true in the United States and in most Western countries. People just simply don't, ask them. These surveys that you see, as Faisal mentioned, show that people just don't really trust the major news organizations to tell them the truth. That is, I think, we ascribe a lot of it to the advent of social media and these new organizations. That's part of it. The much bigger reason for it, I'm sorry to say, especially in the United States, to some extent in the UK too, which I'm very familiar with, was because for a very, very long time, the media was dominated by people who had a particular political viewpoint, which tended to be towards the left. And so all of the major news organizations in America, slightly different in Britain, but the major news organizations in America, the New York Times, the major news networks, the Washington Post, their coverage, the way they covered news stories and their opinion pages for decades reflected a viewpoint that was to the left of the political spectrum and certainly to the left of a significant number of the American public. And people kind of got wise to that. They saw that this was the way they covered, whether they were covering taxes and spending, whether they were covering the political races, whether they were covering issues like abortion or guns or all the other big hot button issues that mattered to a lot of Americans. They saw that the coverage was incredibly biased. So they stopped trusting them and started instead to seek news organizations that actually they thought gave a more, they would say more objective, but certainly to them more sympathetic view of the world. That's why Fox News was founded. Rupert Murdoch, who's ultimately my boss at the Wall Street Journal too, has an old joke that he founded Fox News in 1996 because he thought there was a niche in the market, and the niche turned out to be more than 50%. Because they were people who wanted news that wasn't just the sort of hegemonic, liberal, progressive viewpoint. And so that's how that came about. So we've now got this bifurcated media here in the United States and also, again, in many Western countries where people actually now choose the media they want to read based on their own prior positions. I like to say that the media used to play the role of kind of like a quasi-judicial institution where it would supposedly kind of weigh up the issues, give people the evidence, and let the people, the jury, kind of decide on the big issues in a quasi-judicial fashion. Now news organizations play a sort of quasi-religious role, which is that they play the role of sort of like prayer books or, breviaries or whatever, so that they can reassure people that they are in fact thinking they are going to go to heaven, they are thinking the right things about the right subjects, this is how they should behave, by the way, in case, if they want to remain true to their principles. So we've no longer got media, with a few exceptions, and this is where I'll come to the business model point. We've no longer really got media that even largely attempts to try to do journalism that is genuinely objective. We've got media that largely appeals to people on the basis of their audience. And that has been accelerated by, and this is the business model point, that's been accelerated by changes in the business model. 25 years ago, especially in newspapers, when I started, more than that, when I started out in newspapers were funded 90% by advertising. When I worked at the Wall Street Journal, when I worked at the Financial Times in the 1990s, 90% of the FT's revenue was from advertising. When the internet came along and all that advertising went to Google and Facebook and all the other digital platforms, our advertising collapsed. The Wall Street Journal, which I was editor of, between 2000 and 2010, the journal's advertising revenue dropped by 80%. That's normally a kind of an extinction level event for any organization. So what happened was we rebuilt our revenue base by relying more on subscriptions, so that we were selling directly to people, persuading them to pay $300 or $400 a year for a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. The New York Times followed the same route. The Financial Times followed the same route after the Wall Street Journal. In our case, as a business newspaper, we were able to sort of maintain, I think, a fairly objective approach because a lot of what we were doing was business news. But other news organizations discovering this business model realized that they had to do news that appealed to a particular audience. So it was like appealing to people who already wanted to read that kind of stuff. It was no longer relying on advertisers who didn't really care what was in the paper as long as you reached a large audience. Now, if you're going to sell that product to individuals in the country or around the world, you've got to offer them broadly the kind of stuff they want to hear. And the problem of trust has bifurcated the media into largely partisan ideological camps. And then on top of that, the pressures of the business model, the changing business model, has actually deepened and accelerated that process. And again, that's fundamentally why we don't have a media with the glaring exception of the Wall Street Journal, I would argue, maybe a couple of others, we have a media that people don't really trust because they only trust their side of the media. If the New York Times, when Donald Trump famously said, if I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any votes, he was absolutely right. Because the people who read the media that are friendly to Donald Trump wouldn't believe it. They just say, no, it didn't happen, don't believe it. So that's a fundamental problem, too, for democracy, that we don't any longer have institutions in the media that are really capable of playing a role of keeping authority accountable and making them accountable, because people don't have any trust in them. They don't believe what they read unless it suits their own political view. And that is a fundamental problem, not just for the media, but for democracy.
Thank you, Gerard. I just want to make sure we have a few minutes left. As this session has tackled freedom of expression, I want to make sure we're not repressing anybody's right to ask questions. If you do have a question, please do raise your hand for any of the panelists. Otherwise, I do want to challenge you a little bit on the business model aspect. Look, I also lived in the United Kingdom and saw the progression of the media. In one aspect, weren't we also deceived by the fact that the technology meant, or the limitations of technology at the time, meant that you can only have 5 local broadcasters. Satellite television wasn't invented or conceived at that time. So there was almost a monopoly. Probably it was very costly for newspapers to be shipped from abroad, so you were kind of restricted to the newspapers that you had in the United Kingdom. In a way, what I'm trying to say, did the media have an unfair advantage that technology now has taken away, and now we just have to deal with it?
I don't want to monopolize the conversation, so very briefly, I'll say, yes, I agree with you. And it is, I agree there are many deleterious aspects of the social media and of the digital age, but it is also true that many, many more people now read or view news and information than ever was the case 50 years ago. The Wall Street Journal, sorry to keep coming back to my paper, at our maximum in the peak in the old days of print, we reached about 2.5 million. We had about 2.5 million subscribers. We've now got 4.5 million subscribers. But much more important than that, because of digital accessibility, we reach tens of millions of people every day. So while it's true that it has damaged the business model of some organizations, and while it's also true that it has allowed, frankly, all kinds of dubious so-called news sources to spring up, it has actually also dramatically enhanced the ability of all news organizations to reach a much larger audience.
Right, I've seen no hands from the audience, so I'm going to take one final word from each of you, and I'm going to make it very quick. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our profession? Suzanne?
Oh, I'm very optimistic. I think there's a great interest for people. I mean, just what Gerard was saying, reaching a broader audience, and also getting out of these local markets, which you just described. That's something positive about the digital revolution, that you can now have this more global readership, reading your material, have this thirst for knowledge and information. So I think that's a positive.
Great. Andrew?
I'm broadly optimistic as long as, and I think I speak for all of us on this one, media proprietors continue to see the sense in investing in the product, by which I mean spending money on journalists.
5 seconds.
I'm going to say I'm optimistic, but in a sort of characteristically British way. A former British Prime Minister, as the night was sort of closing in on his premiership and everything was going wrong and he was clearly going to be out shortly, used to say, I like to see the glass as 1/10 full rather than 9/10 empty.
Right, and speaking of crackdown of the freedom of expression, the floor manager has just given us the signal. I want to thank our panelists for what has been a truly insightful, almost like a therapy session for people in our profession. And thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you so much.